So we will get started. Thank you so much for joining us for the fourth webinar in our spring series now, fifth, sorry. The series theme is Trauma and Healing, Teaching and Learning in Today's Climate. My name is Kim Klett, and I am the Deputy Executive Director for the Educators Institute for Human Rights. You'll also see on the screen Kate English, our Executive Director. EIHR cultivates partnerships among educators globally to create materials and deliver training based on best practices in Holocaust and human rights education. Together, we deliver content and strategies for teaching conflict history and prevention and sustainable peace. Learn more about us at eihr.org. We are so happy to have so many of you with us today, both returning participants and some new folks. We know you will enjoy today's session with Dr. Stephanie Arel, entitled Testimony and Teaching, the Personal and Social Costs of Confronting Trauma. We hope you can join us April 16th for our last webinar in the series, when we feature Biz Herman on how we speak about trauma. And I'll put that registration link in the chat box in just a minute. I would like to begin with a brief land acknowledgement. EIHR respectfully acknowledges the Piscataway and Nakachank or Anacostan people and the elders both past and present throughout the generations who have stewarded the land where EIHR gathers. And to learn about on whose land you reside, please visit native-land.ca, and I'll put that link in the chat box as well. So I would like to introduce our guest today, Dr. Stephanie Arel. Stephanie Arel, PhD of Boston University, teaches at Fordham University. She is the author of Affect Theory, Shame and Christian Formation in 2016, and the co-editor of Post-Traumatic Public Theology, also of 2016, Ideology and Utopia in the 21st Century, The Surplus of Meaning in Ricoeur's Dialectical Concept, which came out in 2018, and Human Dignity at the Thresholds from 2023 this year. She holds an integrative trauma certificate and trauma treatment in a clinical setting from the National Institute for the Psychotherapies, New York, and is trained in compassion fatigue for professionals. Her latest book, Bearing Witness, The Wounds of Trauma at Memorial Museums, will be published in September 2023 by Fortress Press. The American Academy of Religion recently awarded her a grant to produce a podcast entitled Bearing Witness, The Impact of Memorialization. She has given workshops around the globe on the psychological, social, and spiritual costs of the chronic encounter with traumatic content. As an Andrew W. Mellon Fellow at the National September 11th Memorial Museum, Dr. Arel recognized costs, psychological, spiritual, and physical, aligned with responding to mass trauma and participating in communal recovery. The impact of bearing witness at memorial museums emerged in the lives of workers. To explore the phenomenon, she visited Auschwitz, interviewing those who remember the Holocaust horrors while resisting its infiltration in their personal lives. The immensity of honoring the dead for others inspired additional sojourns in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Cambodia, Israel, South Africa, and the United States. She discovered dimensions of pride and care evident in those who honor memory, the capacity of workers to address reverberating political tensions while tending to visitor needs, the passion workers have for giving voices to the voiceless who died during traumatic events, while offering care and support to the survivors, and the reality that reassembling the fragments of mass trauma is not for the weary, but instead emerges as a calling and a vocation. So again, this book, Bearing Witness, which I can't wait to read in September, places value on what workers do, opening space for workers' testimonies to be heard for the first time, creating a global community of and for those workers who have otherwise never been given a platform to speak about their experiences. The interviews reveal the entanglement of politics with commemoration, the sacredness of remembering, and the multidimensional aspects of care, transforming the reader's understanding of humanity forever. So as Dr. Arel is speaking, please feel free to put questions in the chat box. We'll try to queue those up for Dr. Arel, and then we also will give time afterwards for more questions if you have them. So thank you, Dr. Arel, so much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for having me, and thank you for that lovely introduction. Hello, everyone. I will start by sharing my screen. Let's put this in a presentation viewpoint and show you that. I think you should see only the presentation.
Right now, I'm seeing some beautiful mountains and water.
Oh, I see it. No, that is not what I would like.
It was a lovely view.
All right, see if that. I see it.
Yes, there we go.
Yes. Okay. All right. So this is an overview of what we'll do today. It's quite broad. I hope that I will be able to narrow it quickly enough for it to make some logical, cognitive, and emotional sense to everyone that's here today. I will speak for roughly 20 minutes. I'm going to try to keep it at 20 because I think in my experience talking about this, some of the richest reflections come in the questions. If there aren't questions, I can continue, but I would encourage people to be specific about things that they're interested in related to this topic. One other short point of introduction is that one of my central concerns as I was looking at this question of commemorating mass trauma was really the sort of both psychological and spiritual guidance that people working in this field offer others, often to their own expense. So it was as if when I started doing the interviews, I was interviewing people who were trained in museum studies or related disciplines, but who simultaneously functioned as therapists and spiritual counselors or even religious leaders in their communities. So, and not named as such. So actually just assuming the role naturally as a response to commemorating mass death and honoring those who died and those who survived. So let's start by taking a closer look at the book. That's the cover. I did over 82 interviews. About 20 of those were group interviews. One of the groups was actually in Bosnia, although I did individual interviews there as well. For those of you from Bosnia, you may know Velma Sarek, and I know I'm not pronouncing that precisely, but Velma was pretty instrumental in helping me navigate Bosnia and doing survivor interviews. So I went to 10 countries and basically interviewed people from 19 memorial and museums and people doing work independently of institutions for human rights organizations, though I would say only about 5 people accounted for that. In the process of the research, I asked 3 questions. I asked about people's background at any given institution, their nature of engagement with the content. So how did they do the work? Where were they located in any given institution? And then from where did they draw meaning? So every single person had an answer for why they were doing the work. And it generally, and I can't ever remember one person saying it was because of the money. The second question I asked had to do with the trauma history, either independent from or inclusive of the trauma commemorated at the site. And the third question related to workers' needs. So you'll see this little gray box out of the 82 interviews. And so looking at them as individuals, 35% of the people doing the work of commemoration are survivors of the particular event. That, of course, changes in commemoration of the Holocaust and in Cambodia. But then you get this number of 30% being family, friends, or impacted locals. And then 35% roughly are community members who were not directly impacted by the event, but very frequently had some tie that created a level of emotional attachment, I would say, to the commemorative process. An important data to keep in mind related to this reality that people are tending to mass trauma, teaching about mass trauma, negotiating the after effects of mass trauma, is that in any given environment, you're generally dealing with about 60% who have been traumatized in some way in their life. That figure ranges sometimes between 40 and 70, but I would say most of the research shows that about 60% of us have some kind of trauma history. So that's important, I think, when we're thinking about the effects of doing the confrontation. So I'm going to throw out a lot of detail that deserves and demands a little bit more depth, but that I want to at least introduce to you as the effects, or help you envision what happens when we have the experience of trauma, or in fact, we are confronting traumatic content chronically. And Bruce Perry is a psychologist, or a psychiatrist rather, that looks at the experience of little t traumas. So I would account for that as seeing, for instance, personal artifacts or images, or hearing stories of trauma on a daily basis that, when it's not addressed, can actually lead to the same effects as a big T trauma, say, for instance, being the survivor of a particular genocide. So this actually extends beyond the experience of genocide. And I don't know if beyond is the right word, but applies to both big T traumas and cumulative little t traumas, which is our body's response to the trauma with fight, flight, and freeze mechanisms. The intrusion generally indicates a trigger that will inspire one of these mechanisms. An intrusion basically accounts for the remembering of the trauma, nightmares one might have, flashbacks, creating this environment where the past trauma feels as if it's pressing in on, colliding with, or infiltrating the present. Now, a way to think about that in terms of teaching content or commemorating mass trauma has to do with in any particular day or in any particular time where the immersion becomes so much that the experience of it feels really fragmenting, so that it's as if oneself is in little pieces. And behaviors that might emerge related to this have to do with having insomnia, so having sleep issues, or needing to do some kind of medicating in order to manage the stimulus, or alternatively, I think it left my mind, experiences such as walking into a wall, or forgetting your keys, or forgetting where you leave things, or having small amnesia episodes. That's an effect of this intrusion. Constriction is sort of the opposite experience of the external. Now it kind of turns internal and creates the freeze, more of the freeze mechanism, where intrusion's going to manifest more as fight or flight, which is our trying to manage somehow. So constriction is this, okay, I can't manage, so I'm just going to turn inward. I'm going to pretend like it didn't occur, or I'm going to compartmentalize it to an extent where I'm going to deny that it being the big T or little t trauma has any present day effect on me. No, it's just to the side. Indifference, moral indifference even, which is a big critique of people that are engaged, for instance, like Elie Wiesel, in thinking about why it's important to have memory of an event. Indifference can manifest as this type of constriction, feeling kind of suffocated by the story, and also powerlessness, a sense of powerlessness to do anything about it. So then withdrawal or depression is the better option. So when I go to the personal, I'm going to kind of create a link to this symptomatology that I just talked about related to constriction, intrusion. But before I go to that, I want to talk about something I think is really, really important when dealing with trauma, and specifically when engaged with telling traumatic histories or commemorating traumatic histories. And this is this dialectic of trauma, or trauma's logic. So literally, Judith Lewis Herman, who I referred to earlier in the last slide with the little parentheses, calls this the conflict between the will to deny horrible events and the will to proclaim them aloud. Now, what does that mean? So if I start at the most broad, Bosnia comes to mind, and the Balkan states deal with this pretty frequently, which is this layer of political strife where the perpetrating group and other groups support denial of the event, minimization of the event, and denial being the most extreme, where they're saying that this didn't happen or that these crimes aren't accurate. And then you have this opposing group, generally the victimized group, or the group that identifies as being receiver of the perpetration, saying, wait a minute, this did happen, and we need to proclaim the actuality, reality of this history and demand acknowledgement. So it is this kind of seesaw, not only present in Bosnia, and I would say in operation, and every political climate, although it manifests differently. The person that serves the memory is engaged in this dilemma continually. So again, we have this political level where the politics demand, no, this didn't happen. And then another group is saying, yes, it did. That starts to infiltrate, and it can go either direction, down into smaller groups. If you look at it within family systems, for instance, something may happen to a child that the family doesn't want to be public. So what will happen is, oh, you can deal with it, keep it internal. We're not going to deal with it. We'll just deal with it in therapy, but we're not going to address the perpetration. And so there is even then this, on a smaller scale, logic of, or debate between not saying and saying the particular trauma. This happens oftentimes within museum departments where, and even within academic communities, I see it happening where it's like, we don't really want to talk about trauma. Oh yes, we need to address it. I would say politically in the United States right now, is in education, we're dealing with, okay, if anybody's seen the recent DeSantis reports trying to change academic freedom, we're not going to teach critical race theory. And then there's another group saying one must. This all puts us, all of these different manifestations locate us in the dialect of trauma, or trauma's logic. On an individual level, it's the exact same thing as constriction and intrusion, or I will show you hyperarousal and hypoarousal. It relates to dissociation. So if I was to articulate the vocabulary that goes on an individual level, it would be, oh my gosh, something terrible happened to me, or this is awful, or this experience I had at work today, discovering a personal artifact really affected me. And then, wait a minute, it's me, I'm crazy, that wasn't so bad. Why am I thinking that this is bad? That's still this back and forth that trauma starts to create. So what do we do about that if we find ourselves in this logic? The social level is a little bit more difficult to deal with than the individual personal level. I'm going to go right to this slide. But I think that it is helpful if one understands at least what's happening on a personal level, because then there are ways to think about how to respond or manage on an individual level, which is sometimes all that we can do. So this is not mine, but it is the idea is not mine, but this is my interpretation of what happens with hyperarousal and hypoarousal. So these are very similar to constriction and intrusion, but more talk about what's going to happen physiologically to us when we are exposed to traumatic content. So, or exposed to the traumatic experience or the experience of trauma. In the first case, it's hyperarousal, so feeling panicked, irritated. Irritation is actually a big one, I think, because oftentimes when something is triggering, the dialectic encourages us to minimize the experience, and then that comes out anyway, because it's not addressed through the experience of being irritated or defensive or too sensitive, or overly sensitive, I should say. Hyperarousal is the opposite response, generally going numb, having low energy, not wanting to be around people. It is indicative generally of shame, sort of withdrawing, not wanting to put oneself out there, wanting to deal with it alone. Why I have these arrows and why I articulate exercise or these things we can do in the top right corner of hyperarousal and the bottom left corner of hyperarousal, it is to try to break apart something that I think that happens related to trauma, which is here's the list of things you can do and they're all equal. And I don't think that that's true, because it's really dependent on the individual and how the individual responds, and we respond differently. So if someone is in hyperarousal, then things that are going to create a sense of physiological safety or calm, which is what this window of tolerance indicates, those are the things one might want to do. Whereas if someone is depressed or feeling hopeless, and this sense of hypoarousal, then the activity or management technique is going to be something that is stimulating, which won't help somebody in hyperarousal. So I think it's worth thinking about and thinking about how one self responds in order to do deep, what I would call deep self-care or self-soothing or self-nurturance. Especially when caught in the circumstances of the dialect of trauma. So let's get out of this. This bigger group, just to start, summarizes really what happens when content alarms. And I've alluded to this need for physiological safety. I referred briefly to the collapsing of time, which again is that idea of intrusion. So the fact that the trauma is going to feel as if it's in the present, specifically to communities that do any kind of work with trauma, can also be this idea of secondary traumatic stress or compassion fatigue. And I think one of the greatest risks, besides physiological symptomatology, as what I've just talked about, is the idea that this exposure to the content's going to lead to some kind of change worldview. And I think within the field of memorialization broadly, that's a danger. So how do I locate hope in the face of teaching, talking about, or commemorating genocide continually, And then watching genocide continually perpetuate itself, or watching mass violence, if it's not exactly a genocide, happen in real time in the world. What is the value of my work? How do I locate that? So these get to put broader questions of meaning and purpose. And then again, back to the hypoarousal, which is where I started at this slide. So I think that's about it for me. If I could leave you with something, is the idea that there are these questions of meaning and purpose around doing memorialization, and also psychological, emotional, physiological, and I'm missing one word in there, emotional, I think, but I might have said that, risks related to memorialization. I think also an important point is that dealing with trauma is dealing with trauma, and having a history of trauma increases the risk of the impact of dealing with trauma chronically. What can people do is both individual, organizational, and institutional, related to any particular given field. But I do think that sometimes starting with the self is the most effective, because it allows for regulation, which is super important in being able to do the work. And I would say that that's something I underscore because, and I'll end here, in this field, memorialization or teaching about mass trauma, one is asked to be cognitively engaged, professional, proficient, while simultaneously encouraged to have an emotional connection, sensitivity, ability to have empathy related to the content itself. And that is a high demand. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. And I put a note in the chat box for all of our participants. Please feel free to put questions in the chat box, or you can, if you'd like to personally ask, we can unmute you. But I wanted to start with the question. I thought it was so interesting the way you did the breakdown of who these people are working at these memorial centers or museums. And I wondered, what did you find, because you went to 10 different countries and all these different experiences. What did you find both in common with the people you interviewed, and what did you find maybe unique in certain places?
So the first thing that comes to mind related to the commonality has to do with I think I mentioned this, but I would say the level of commitment to the missions. So the belief that I sort of alluded to that, I didn't say it that way. So that the level of saying, I believe in this mission, and taking it not only to a professional degree, but also it's a personal calling or vocation, as you read at the beginning. So the attachment to the mission, 100%. I would say in institutions that, the Holocaust, particularly related to the Holocaust, particularly, and to 9/11, is the question of relevancy, and the question of what do we do as we're losing survivors, or what do we do with a narrative gets a lot of critique related to the American, the national American narrative that we hear. So how do we make these things relevant? For the Holocaust, that's particular to survivor loss. To 9/11, it's interesting because the mission is focused on terrorism. And so I think that there's a real internal push to think about how that connects to other communities. They're still evolving, so we'll see what happens with that mission. Another big difference, has to do with what's happening politically in any country. And I mean, so that's a whole nother conversation, because I mean, what the feeling and passion in Bosnia, because of the amount of denial, is something different than what's happening in South Africa or Rwanda, where I didn't go, where you have government money, funding, and support saying we must remember these histories. So the difference in the feeling of support, encouragement, the difference in compassion fatigue, and I wouldn't even say that I had the experience of the people in Bosnia were tired. It was more like come on, people, you know, like the energy was high, but I think that also itself has a cost. And then you have Cambodia, where there's this integration of multiple countries supporting the process of memorialization. So France is there, Germany is there, Japan is contributing money. And the kids, it's mostly kids doing all of that work who have families that suffered from the Khmer Rouge. So they're doing this for their parents. This is about how they stay close to their parents. So, I mean, that's just like scratching the surface, I think, of the differences, but does that speak to your question a little bit?
Absolutely. Thank you. Kate?
Yeah, and if I may just follow up, you sort of started answering the question that I was going to ask about settings where denial is a big factor. So I was thinking of Bosnia. I was also thinking about here in the United States with the divisions about things that happened on January 6th, for example. And then I'm noticing other folks in the chat box who are in different situations where the denial is something that they live with even as the trauma is ongoing. So what can you tell us about that, the component of denial, and maybe a little more depth?
The component of the denial related to how to manage it, or related to what I see as a dynamic?
I would say first, like large scale, the impact at a sociological level that you would see, and then also, you know, how do we support students, fellow teachers, ourselves, if we're in that situation where the denial is a factor?
So, to be honest, I mean, there's not been a lot written on this, which it seems so obvious that, I mean, it's something I've given a lot of thought to in terms of thinking about if I need to do more writing on it, because it is what happens. It is just what happens, and people can locate themselves somewhere in that, related to egregious histories and ongoing present violence. So one of the things to know about trauma recovery is that the acknowledgement of an event can do so much to prevent symptomatology, can do so much to lessen the effective impact of any given event. It is just a necessary component. To the extent to which groups and individuals working with each other can acknowledge the trauma, even when the politics aren't supporting that. I'm trying not to read that at the same time. I think that's a place that we all can start with. So like participating in acknowledgement, even if there's other bodies that are not participating, is helpful, period. So yes, and I think what's even more at stake, and I'm curious as to why this is happening, and I'm going to do some work with a student next semester, a big research project on this, is this ongoing and even more potent, subtly potent pressure, at least in this country, but I think it has legs, is the saying we don't have to remember. Like there's some benefit at forgetting. There's a new book out, and the New York Times just did a big thing on it and gave it a lot of good press, and I bought it, and it works maybe on some scale for some individuals, but when we're talking about political violence against huge groups, saying to forget, it's difficult to deal with. I would say the other area where to be aware of is and this is very academic and supported in some circles, which is the sort of questioning of the commercialization of memory, which is valid on one side, but then it is the point of entrance for critiquing memory in general. Right? So it's all of those things give us slippery slopes towards denial. So what does it mean to acknowledge a trauma? And in what ways can we push back against scholarship and critique that vilifies memory? And how then, I mean, the question then remains, what's the best way to remember? But that's another question, right? That's another field of research. So does that help?
Yeah, thank you. And we've got several questions in the chat box. I'm going to kind of take them connected to what you're talking about, and then I'll hit all of them. So if you've asked a question and it doesn't come up right away, I'll get to it. Julson, who is one of our partners in the DRC, had a question. He said, he has two questions. First, could you please explain what steps you could take to address trauma in the family circle? And then secondly, do you think museums with exhibits of mass atrocities should have some kind of section afterwards to help take care of emotions during visits?
Let me start with the last one because it's a little quicker of an answer. I think that it's helpful. I think that some places don't have the space for that. I just did, for the podcast, we just interviewed somebody related to the Holocaust, and she was talking about how at the Galatia Museum in Krakow, there isn't a space, but there are nearby synagogues. So they have a kind of list for people if they want to go and process, places that they can go, be alone, be with their thoughts. The African American History Museum in the United States has a big commemorative room that they ask people to be silent inside. So I think that is also useful. I guess my ultimate, if I'm landing with an answer on that question, I think it's less important if the institution itself has one, but more important to say that might be, that might enrich somebody's experience or help them process what they've seen. If there are places one can be directed to, if space is prohibited. I do think psychologically, though, it goes along with the concept of acknowledging that this might be an effective experience, or it might trigger a trauma memory, and that being available to oneself to do some self-nurturing prayer, whatever method somebody wants to use, that's acknowledged as a need after being immersed in a traumatic history. In terms of the family system, that is really complex. I do think that, if I'm going to hark on this again, that the idea of acknowledgement is critical. It's sort of, the answer is very dependent also on what we're talking about in terms of trauma. If there is an event that takes place outside of the family or inside of the family that can be named and is addressed quickly, there's about a 3-month window physiologically to the neurobiological imprint of trauma in our memory systems. So there's this first 3 months is really important for intervention, whatever that intervention is going to be, in order to not allow the emotional experience of the trauma itself to imprint itself in the way our neurons work. So it's kind of like, if you think about, if you're going to run a race in 3 months for 3 miles, you want to do as many 1 or 2 mile runs as you can to kind of reinforce this neurological pathway, then I can run the 3 miles in 3 months. It's the opposite analogy, right? So you have something that's happened that it's going to create nightmares, stress, strife among family members. And if it's allowed to kind of fester there, it's going to make an imprint. And in about 3 months, it's much, much harder to change those neurological pathways because the body's kind of solidified it. So that's one answer to that question. I think when I'm looking at, if people approach me that have things going on in the family, one thing that I press always is that generally trauma is not, especially in a family system, it's not just one person's issue. So everybody plays a role, and that doesn't mean everybody's a perpetrator or people are bad people. It does mean, though, that there is an interplay there, and isolating one family member as, oh, we have to take care of this person to whom the trauma happened, is not the most effective means of addressing the trauma. Everybody's involved. I have a student right now who is a victim of sexual assault, whose dad just cannot get out of his own way because of the guilt level of not protecting her. So she's doing a project on how do we address dads who feel like they've failed. That is just to indicate he's also involved, and actually in a way of feeling culpable. So everybody in the family unit has some kind of response that can be attended to, that can help whomever the trauma, if that's the example, whoever that trauma happened to.
And Stephanie, I've heard that a very similar dynamic in, I believe it was Darfur, where women were asking why
Yes.
there were men who left, and the men responded with, in this case, it was an individual man in an audience at an event I attended. And he said, they leave because they know they're helpless and they failed you. So it sounds like a very similar dynamic to what you were just describing with your student.
So yes, and I would say that this helplessness is a very big indicator of having a traumatic response. So that sensation of helplessness indicates that somebody is responding to a trauma with a symptom of trauma. Yeah, helplessness and powerlessness, and both of those fit into the example, Kate, that you give.
Okay, a couple more questions, and this one kind of ties into a little bit with the family part, so I'll ask that next. Dinah is asking, is learning about the Holocaust and genocide traumatizing to middle and high school students, in your thoughts? And if so, how can teachers and both parents as well be prepared to address this?
This is a great question about pedagogy. So what I think, if you teach these histories, there's a way in which you feel comfortable teaching them. That's one thing. And I want to say that your comfort, the person in authority or power, your comfort and safety yourself is primary, because I don't think that can be created in a classroom if the person doesn't feel comfortable with the way that they're teaching the topic. My second thing, though, so for me, I don't show traumatic photos. I don't do it. It's just a choice I make. But there's a reason that I don't do that. So on the level, there's many reasons, but one of them has to do with thinking about trauma. And I think that this question that I ask about the photos can be applied to any methodology, which is this method going to indicate a lack of safety in the classroom? So, and what does safety mean? There are two ways to think about it. One is physiological, and the other is environmental. So one has to do with the internal experience, and one has to do with everything on the outside. Now, it may be the case, one never knows to whom one's talking as a teacher, right? It may be the case that physiological safety will not be maintained. So a couple things. One, always telling the kids this could be disturbing. Being very transparent about that is another point of acknowledgement. So this may be upsetting to you. Another thing, here's how we're going to make sure that we keep this compartmentalized, or keep this box of this story in our history class. And here's what we're going to do after to make sure everybody feels okay in their bodies. This is just an example. And again, I'm projecting the way I might do it. So I think people have to get comfortable with their own. I think the goal here is to create as much safety as possible, as much knowledge around what could happen, and then methods to address it. So we're going to talk about this for 1 hour. So putting boundaries on it is also helpful, and telling students from 11 to 12, we're going to do this. And then at 12, we're going to go take a walk outside. We're going to go by the park over here. I mean, whatever, we're going to go have lunch. Everybody's going to share something good that happened to them this week. I mean, again, method is particular. I mean, the questions are similar, but how one goes about doing these things is very individual. So I said a lot, so let me just give a summary of that. Thinking about how to create internal safety and external safety. External safety is something the teacher has control of, internal maybe not. The external has to do with being transparent about what could happen and what will happen. That's the way of doing, creating boundaries in the classroom, having means for release afterwards, having places for them also perhaps to discuss if it did affect them, having closure at the end, maybe some reflection on it, again, to acknowledge that this might have affected people, but always keeping it within boundaries. Did that answer the question?
Definitely. And I think you gave some new things for me to think about in the classroom. I really like that. Thank you. I want to go back to Karen had a question at the beginning, and Karen asked, do you think people who choose to work at memorial museums and are not traumatized with that big T have certain general characteristics?
Oh, have certain general characteristics. Yes, I do. I found, and this does depend on department, so it does not apply necessarily to people who work in tech. But I would say overall that they score, and we did a survey of this with about 60 to 65 people, score high on an empathy scale. So there's actually a metric for that. And so I would say, yes, there's a high level of empathy. I also think that if we keep in with this idea of 60%, and 60%, if you think about that as people having trauma, this does not have to mean that the trauma was a sexual assault or child abuse, for instance. It can have to do with what's called these cumulative little t traumas. So say people that have felt a lower sense of belonging growing up, or who have had a parent die and then end up having sort of attachment difficulties, that those get cumulative and create this sense of caring for others. This sort of need to care for, which is really a projection of care towards the self. And I think that dynamic comes up also. I am not sure statistically how that would affect an empathy questionnaire. My guess is that would potentially affect high levels of empathy, but I would definitely land on the levels of empathy being high in any given person.
Yeah, that was actually an exercise at my high school. They had us take that test, and I'm happy to say the English department was the most empathetic. It's really interesting.
Surprised.
Yeah, it was really interesting. Jenna had a question too. She said, given how collective sites of memorial and individual memory of traumatic events like genocide can target different elements of the trauma, how can or should the two interact, and what should be the goal of collective sites of memorial?
Can you read that to me again, the first part?
Yeah, so the first part was, given how collective sites of memorial and individual memory of traumatic events like genocide can target different elements of the trauma, how can or should the two interact?
Collective versus individual?
I believe so. And Jenna, if I got that wrong, feel free to jump in.
How should collective and interact? I'm not really getting can you interpret that?
Let me see if I can go back to it. I was kind of jotting it down because these go by so quickly.
I'll maybe take a shot at it, Kim.
Yeah,
So
please.
what I'm hearing Jenna say is the difference between the interaction between any site of memory, a memorial site, and an individual's experience with trauma. How do they? Yeah.
I mean, okay, that's sort of what I thought. So this is, I think, a very complex question, and there are different ways to answer it. One way is to talk about what is the institution's responsibility, or what's the department's responsibility, or what's the individual's responsibility in responding to an individual's response. So what should the institution have in place that's addressing the way that people respond, and where it's the individual's responsibility in dealing with their own response. So that's one way of entering that, although I don't think that that gets at the deeper question that's here. This is added. So what should be the goal, if I can understand this? I think that the first goal would be on institutional and departmental levels to be able to be pretty explicit about the fact that the content can be triggering, that the content can be disturbing, and not try to sweep that under the rug. The other thing I would say is that it's a little bit irrelevant. It is a little bit irrelevant where someone's located in terms of how they're encountering the content. So I'll give you one example. A lot of people who feel as if they're removed from direct negotiation with the content, so outside of doing tours, for instance, maybe they're in marketing, so they get exposed less frequently to the content, make decisions to immerse themselves to stay connected to the mission. To me, the idea of entering into the trauma narrative to keep it relevant is a pretty profound thing. It may indicate empathy. It also indicates this attachment to purpose and mission, like I said earlier. If we're talking about why I said that is sometimes I hear, well, we see it all the time because we do tours and the people in the offices get less immersion, or the people that are more removed or just doing the research don't see it. It's just seeing it is not the only way to experience it, right? And I don't think that the point of comparisons are that useful, because everybody has different backgrounds or commitments or attachments to missions, and those can be more or less for the individual triggering. And it's very hard to judge that because everybody's just different. In terms of the collective response and the individual response, if that's what we're talking about on an emotional level, how to make those two things, I think it's important to keep in mind that there are collective narratives that people experience and draw strength from the collective impetus towards recovery. And there are often people that feel or experience themselves as outside of the collective. And to the extent that individual experiences, especially when they don't match with the dominant narrative, or alternatively, the true historical account doesn't match individual memory, that as long as that individual experience isn't hurting other people, it's a little bit irrelevant. So this is what I mean. I had a question when I was working with the Holocaust Museum about a survivor who came in, not a survivor, I'm sorry, a daughter of a survivor who kept pushing back on the tour guide saying, no, this is not what my mother or father experienced. And he's like, what do I do about it? Because the history says something different than her experience. I said, acknowledge her experience. and say there may be variations in the historical narrative that can't necessarily be verified or accounted for, but your experience is valid. Done. I mean, again, that goes back to the idea of acknowledging individual experience.
Thank you. And we have a really good question from Elliot in the Q&A. He says he has a question regarding the fight, flight, freeze model as a response to imminent threats. Recently, new models have also proposed a fourth trauma response called fawning, or attempting to appeal to the morality of the perpetrator, excusing the perpetrator's actions. Have you seen fawning play out in your experience working with survivors of mass traumas, particularly in the light of systematic erasure and diminution of colonialism's culpability in creating mass traumas and shaping survivors' experiences of or to mass traumas?
That's a really good question. So in terms of integrating it into the dominant model, I would need to see a little more data on how that's physiologically comparable. For animals, that's called the appeasement display. I wonder if it's the same neurologically. I don't know the answer to that question. In terms of how it operates for humans, it enters into more of a cognitive realm, which takes it out of this sort of like amygdala, lower brain, reptilian brain response. So the fight or flight freeze would be differentiated based on where it's processed in the brain. So I don't know neurologically about that precisely, but I will say I can talk a little bit about to what Elliot's referring, which is so the appeasement display in animals is an immediate response, acknowledging superiority. It is cognitively what happens in humans related to the experience of shame, and related to a phenomenon that happens on, if I can just speak to a familial level, where there is a willingness to be abused in order to avoid any kind of abandonment. So if we look at it on a political level, many of you might have heard of the Stockholm syndrome. It's the similar idea of identifying with the perpetrator. That can happen at degrees, and it can look different. So all of these words kind of describe a similar experience with finite details related to the particularities of the event. So Leon Wormser does some work on this related to SS officers and their relationship with their children. So how do I understand my parent as a Nazi who killed all of these people, and this is my parent, and I don't want to lose my attachment to the parent. So then there's an identification with, even at the same time, a level of disgust with the parent. How that feeds into shame is that the internal effective response that allows the mechanism to occur is the complete diminishment of self-worth. So that's at the base level of what's happening to allow the whole mechanism is I'm not worthy, self-disgust, self-abjectness. Otherwise the interplay it wouldn't play out in that way.
Thank you. And one more question. Dinah wanted to follow up about, how learning about the Holocaust and genocide can traumatize students. So, how would you answer that question when parents don't want their students to learn about it versus all the great things they can get from learning about that, about empathy and becoming upstanders and things like that?
It's such a hard question. I mean, my gut response would be to this is the point of being a salesman in some way, of creating a rationale for the teaching that's, 3 points of why this is important. that gets to the central concern of the parent, because there's some concern that's unrelated to the event that's being taught. What's the underlying concern? I don't know that that's helpful. That's where I would start with, is talking to the parent and not talking about the Holocaust, but what's the primary concern here? What's the agenda? What would you like your kid to get out of this? So then there's a point of reflection of, can I address these concerns? Or less can, but how can I communicate that I'm addressing these concerns in my engagement as a teacher with this topic? So not even questioning what's going to be taught, but more, here's how I can address your concerns. Again, that gets back to acknowledging that there's some validity in the parent's experience. And also, you know, when we're dealing with trauma, there's 2 points I want to say about that, because this part of the parental interjection, it has this sense of urgency that something dangerous has happened. And so I have to stop it as a parent for whatever psychological mechanisms allows that belief. So one thing is to try to stop that urgency. Anything urgent is going to have this little traumatic residue. So how do I slow all of this down to create that, to stop that sense of urgency? And then the second thing I think is, when, you know, and this, I'm probably speaking to the choir here with teachers, but sometimes the level of rhetoric and what's being said has nothing to do with what's underneath. And so being able to figure out what's going on underneath of any given dynamic with a parent, which requires teachers to also be psychoanalysts, as well as parents, but to figure out what that discourse is so that one can speak to what's happening underneath that discourse. Challenging, but probably worth some reflection.
Well, thank you so much, Stephanie. This was great. I think that our participants got a lot out of it, and it just, again, is really helpful to those of us who are teachers, those of us who volunteer at museums, all different groups of people. So thank you so much for spending your time with us, and participants, thank you for your time today. And we hope to see you on April 16th. There are lots of thank yous in the chat box, so I'll let you see those before we sign off here.
Thank you, everyone.
And yes, thank you.
And if I may just, as we wrap up, I'd just like to reaffirm once again our thanks to Stephanie for being here today. This has been a very rewarding webinar series for us across the year, and we're glad for the participants. We're particularly glad that you've been able to join us today. And if you're following on a recording, thank you for being with us for that as well. If you are able to, we offer these webinars for free. The speakers come on their own goodwill. But if this would move you to make a donation to EIHR and support the work that we do, not only in the webinar series, but for the work of teachers around the world and everything they're doing to end hate, then we would love to hear from you, obviously. So thank you very much. You can donate at our website at www.eihr.org/donate. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.